You could say removing the old engine was the easy part, and you'd probably be right. It's one thing to do a like-for-like engine swap, but there's always extra complications when you're fitting a totally different engine. And I will no doubt have to face quite a few of those complications later on, but for now I just want to get this engine and gearbox mounted in. After all, the mounting points are the same, so just dropping it in shouldn't be too hard. The first job to do then is to fit the clutch release arm and the bearing. The grease I'm using here is a graphite based one, and it just helps to lubricate the moving surfaces. The rubber gaiter on these later gearboxes is nowhere near as good as the earlier ones. The old 1.7 gearbox had a lovely moulded piece which sealed very well, but these ones are basically just a flat sheet which overlaps the hole. One thing I only spotted at the last minute was this dowel piece which was stuck in the end of the gearbox. The new engine already has its own one, and as they can't both have one, I'll have to pull this one out. And a bit of emery paper helps to clean out any remaining dirt and corrosion. While I've got good access, I'm going to fit the gear stick bush now. This one is the later rubber type, which was an improvement over the earlier plastic ones, which had a habit of wearing out, giving that wobbly gear stick feeling. Right, with that done, the gearbox can be fitted onto the engine, and to make it easier, I'll get my dad back in to give me a hand.
Oh, please just go straight on. Oh, look at that! Yeah. Right, bolt in.
Hang on, let me get that dowel lined up. That could not have gone easier, could it?
No.
Oh, I'm chuffed with that. Yeah, come on, mate. Yeah, look at that. Right, that's nipped up. That's nipped up. That's nipped up.
So is that?
I genuinely can't believe how easily that went on. That could easily have fought us for hours if it wanted to. But we're not there yet. Still quite a few bits to go on before it can go in the van. And first up are the engine mounts. These consist of an aluminium bracket which bolts to the side of the engine, and also a steel plate which acts as a spacer, and it also ties in with another bolt hole around the edge of the gearbox. Now, if I had all the brackets I need, then this would be as simple as just bolting them on, but unfortunately on this side I'm missing the steel plate. So I've taken the one off the 1.7 engine, and although it's not exactly the same, it is fairly close, so with a bit of modification it should work. Well, that worked about as well as I could have hoped, so the only thing left now is the starter motor. These can be fitted afterwards, but it's much easier to do it now at this stage. And I've even remembered to fit the bracket which supports the power steering pipes. And yes, these are the bolts from the old engine. I'm not quite sure why they're so long on this motor, but it shouldn't make any difference. Well, I'm pleased that all went smoothly. With the height of the lifting arm and the length of the chains, the clearance at the top can be quite tight, especially considering how high it needs lifting in order for the diff to clear the subframe, so given all that, everything went quite well really. These air hoses and spheres are now totally superfluous, and as well as that, they're also no longer needed, so I'm just going to unbolt the whole assembly from the bulkhead. This solenoid is the only part that I'll need, so I'll keep that safe for later on. And now we come to one of the biggest differences in the setups between the two engines. What's wrong with that, I hear you ask? Well, there's still a throttle body which has to go on somehow. And if that weren't bad enough, there's also the inlet pipe to go on top. Yeah, no chance. Clearly that isn't going to work. The solution then is to swap the entire heater fan assembly out for a different one which does fit, like what would have been fitted to a factory 2.2 model. So I'll start by removing this one. With the heater valve cable and the wiring plug out of the way, all that holds it in are 4 8mm nuts which secure it to the bulkhead. And tricky little things they are too. Time to introduce fan number 3. I've had this for around 4 years now, and this one's actually got the 2.1 diesel engine. Now I do have big plans for it in the coming years, but as I'm not using it on the road just at the minute, I'm going to borrow the heater assembly. This is a 1996 van, so it has the later style assembly, which should just be a straight swap. Although I'm not using it on the road, I still want to be able to start it and move it around, so I'll fit the other assembly back on so I can fill it back up with water. There's actually much more space on the diesel engine, and it almost looks like they could have used the older heater design. It is something I've wondered for a little while now. So, just to satisfy my curiosity, let's see if the duct goes on as well. So, does it fit?
No, it doesn't. Damn close though.
Indeed, it was very close, but just not quite. It was only the end on the throttle cable which fouled. I dare say with a different design it might just have cleared. Anyway, with it set at half throttle, the duct can be clipped in, so that will at least stop any rain getting into the bonnet vent. So, having acquired another heater box, it's just a case of bolting it on and connecting it up. And with the duct on, you can see there's now plenty of room for the throttle body and the inlet pipe. Well, I say plenty of room, it's still quite tight, but that is how it's supposed to be. Now I've got the camera set up directly in line here, and you can see that the difference isn't just with the duct, the fan housing itself is also angled towards the side to help with clearance. Right, time to move on to the next job, and this is something which has a reputation for being, well, complicated, difficult and generally unfathomable are some of the words I've heard people use to describe it. Yes, that's right, it's the wiring. I actually don't mind a bit of wiring, especially if it's all plug and play. And while a lot of this should be plug and play, quite a bit of it won't be, unfortunately. Things like the ECU, the injectors and all the sensors on the engine, that should all just plug straight in, that should be fine. But the tricky bit will be integrating this loom into the van. And to make things worse, this loom has got a little bit of damage in a few places, quite a few wires have been cut when it was removed. So there's a bit of remedial work to be done even before we get to that stage. On the end of these wires should be some connectors which would go onto the lambda sensor and the TPS, or throttle position sensor. When I got the other 2.2 engine, the one from part 1 that this loom came from, the TPS was still in place, it's just someone had cut the wires for some reason, so I do still have the right connector for that. The one for the lambda sensor though is long gone, so I'll have to fit a new connector on there. Now as two of the wires on the TPS are both white and without any tracer colours, I'll have to trace the wires back to the ECU pins and compare those with my other van. I've got my tester set to buzz when it detects continuity, or in other words when there's a connection between the two test leads, and I've put one lead onto one of the white wires and I'm going through the ECU pins one by one until I find which one that wire goes to. That's the one. I'll make a note of which pin it was, and I'll check with my other van to see which pin on the TPS connector that goes to. Right, I've just measured the other van, and the pin on the connector here marked A is this terminal here. So if I get the tester again, that's the one. So that white wire needs to be connected to the pin on this connector marked A, which is that one. Which is that wire there. So that to that one, the other white wire to the other white wire, and of course purple to purple. First job then is to strip the wires back. I'm going to solder these together, so I've slid some heat shrink tubing on first, which will cover the join afterwards. Now, if you ask most people with any soldering experience, they will usually tell you that you should never twist them together beforehand. Instead, they say you should tin both wires first, which just means to cover them liberally in solder, and then hold them together while heating them both so they melt into each other. And despite being a bit controversial, I'm going to say now that I totally disagree with that. Personally, I think this just gives it a higher chance of failure, and in my experience it leads to more dry joints. Now, I've always been of the opinion that you should twist them together first, as this provides mechanical strength during the soldering process and prevents any movement. And I think that's the key really. If there is any movement, even slightly when the solder's cooling, then the joint is more likely to fail. I always start with both wires together in an X configuration, and then holding one side firmly, twist the other side together. And then swap over and twist the second side in the opposite direction. This is a pretty strong joint on its own, and it takes quite a bit of force to pull apart even without any solder. And then the joint can just be soldered as normal. This method leaves a completely flush joint which the heat shrink can easily cover. And yes, a heat gun is better, but I didn't have one here, so a lighter does the job fine. Repeat that 2 more times and you end up with this. And a bit of electrical tape just helps to tidy it up. For the lambda wires, I've found some similar coloured wire to extend them to where they should be and repeated the process. They can then be fed back into the original sleeving. This is the new lambda sensor, and it has the original style connector, which is a bit of a problem because I couldn't find anything to match it, so I'm going to have to replace that for a more common plug that is available. Can't send that back now. This is the connector I've chosen. It's a very common 3-pin Tyco style one, which just needs crimping onto both sets of wires. So the first thing to go on are these rubber seals. Now the pins aren't very long, so only a short piece of insulation needs removing. And the wires on the sensor are those heat resistant type, which just don't strip with normal strippers, so they need slicing round with a Stanley blade instead. And crimping them on is as easy as that. These then simply slide into the connector until you hear that click, and then you know they're secure. And a small screwdriver helps to locate the seals in position. So that's basically it with those connectors. This does of course mean that if I ever need to change the lambda sensor in the future, I'll have to crimp a new plug on, but that's quite a rare event, so I won't worry too much about that. The only other bit of damage on this loom is to this wire, which connects to the oil pressure switch. I've salvaged the right connector from an old 1.7 loom, as the plug on those is the same, so that just needs soldering on as before. And now we come to the biggest challenge with this loom. This is the main multi-plug connector, and everything which connects to the van's wiring goes through here. You'd think it would just be a case of plugging it in, but unfortunately not only are the plugs different, the pinouts aren't the same either. So I'm going to have to trace every single wire on the 1.7 loom, determine exactly which bit of equipment it goes to, do exactly the same on the 2.2 loom, and then match that to how the 1.7 connector is wired. I could change the connector on the van to match the 2.2 loom, but I figured that was the harder of the two solutions. So, to swap the connectors over, I first need to de-pin them, and for that I use half of a split pin, which I've found perfect for pressing those little tabs on the pins. I find when doing this that it helps to push the terminals inwards first before trying to release the tab, as otherwise they tend to jam. One by one then, I'm able to assemble the wires together into the 1.7 connector. Right, if you've managed to stay awake this far, then congratulations, but if you haven't, then I can only apologise. I'll leave it there then for this episode, so join me next time where I've got some exciting things in store. Actually, that's a lie, it's mostly more wiring.